and welcome to Big Picture Monday. My name is Cali Black, here with all the context you need to totally rock this week's Come Follow Me readings. This week, I'm so excited for starting a new section of the New Testament, Romans chapters 1 through 6. I want to talk to you about what this new section of the New Testament is. So I'm going to actually treat the first part of this like an intro to all of this third section of the New Testament. Because when a lot of people think of the New Testament, most of us think of the four Gospels, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We know them. We're familiar with them for good reason, right? They're great. But that is only about half of the New Testament. There's a lot more in it, and that's what we've been studying. So we have the first section of the four Gospels. Those were awesome. The second section is what we just finished up reading, which are the missionary efforts of the apostles and the disciples. And that is only in the book of Acts. So we just read all the kind of factual outline there, mission trip information that we have about what a lot of these apostles and disciples were doing. We know that we learned about Paul, but we also started off studying more about Peter. We had Stephen, lots of other people, right? Now we're going into the third section of the New Testament, and these are the epistles. So epistles, epistles. Epistles cover they're like a huge portion of the rest of the New Testament. If you're looking at our Come Follow Me schedule, we start them right now, and we're going to be reading epistles all the way until the first week in December. So this is going to take up most of our time because the fourth and final section of the New Testament is just the book of Revelation. It's revelations about our days, basically, about the future, from John's perspective. So we are now going to be spending the next few months studying the epistles. Now, what are epistles? Epistles are letters. You may be familiar with that. This was, of course, one of the main ways to communicate with people across long distances at the time. They would write an epistle, they'd write a letter, and they'd send it off with either a messenger, like a trusted servant, or someone who just happened to be traveling that way. They'd say, hey, drop off this letter here. That was how a lot of communication was sent around by church leaders, but also just people in general as well. So the cool thing about the epistles is that they give us this huge window into what the people and the churches and the congregations were actually like at that time. When we read Acts, it's a great overview. It's like a bird's eye view of what's going on, right? But when we read the epistles, we start to learn who these people were. If you think you've learned a lot about Paul so far, just you wait, because now we're going to get to see what he was teaching. And the type of power that comes from reading his words is unmatched. Paul was an amazing writer, at least. The doctrine that he shares is just beautiful. I mean, we still quote a lot of these scriptures today. Such beautiful teachings. Now, did Paul write all of the epistles? No, he did not. He wrote a lot of them, but he did not write all of the epistles. So there are 21 epistles, starting with the book of Romans, which we're going to start this week, and ending with the book of Jude. And there are 21. Paul wrote, most people are pretty sure Paul wrote 14 of them. So about 2/3 of them, right? That Paul wrote. We often call them Pauline epistles, Pauline. These are the Pauline epistles. Now, all of the epistles in general were written from around the years 50 to 90. Okay, 50 to 90 is the range where we have epistles being written that we have record of. The book of Acts ended around 62, 63. Okay, so we have some epistles that were written before the book of Acts ended, and we have a lot of epistles that were written after the book. Before, and we have a lot of epistles that were written after the book of Acts ended as well. Now, how are these all organized? That's a great question. So when we talk about how Paul wrote a lot of these epistles, he wrote some of these epistles to churches, and he wrote some of these epistles to individual people, like certain specific people that he was writing to. And when we look at how these scriptures are organized, they're actually organized into these groupings. So we start off with the epistles that Paul wrote to the churches, to the big groups of people, right? To the Romans, to the Thessalonians, right? We start off with the epistles that Paul wrote to churches. After that, we get the second group, which is the group of epistles that Paul wrote to individual people, okay? And then we go to the third group, which are all of the other epistles that were written by other people, grouped together by who wrote them, if there is someone who wrote more than one. Okay, so grouped together by author. Now, you get these three groups, right? Paul to churches, Paul to individuals, everyone else. Within each individual group, the epistles are arranged in order from longest to shortest, okay? Not chronological order, longest to shortest within each group, okay? So I'm gonna even look at my notes here because I don't have all of these books memorized in the exact order. So when we look at the letters that Paul wrote to the churches, we start off with Romans, which is the longest letter that Paul wrote to a church. Then we have 1st and 2nd Corinthians, then Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, okay? Then we move on to the individuals. Paul writing to individual people. We start with the longest, 1 Timothy, then his second letter to Timothy, then Titus, and then Philemon. And then we end with all of the other ones in order from longest to shortest. And I want to add a caveat here because it starts with the book of Hebrews. And Hebrews, for a long time, the authorship was debated, but now pretty much everyone agrees that Paul wrote the book of Hebrews. So when I said that Paul wrote 14 of the 21 epistles, that is counting the book of Hebrews. However, in the organization, Hebrews is grouped with the others because that wasn't clear for a long time. So Hebrews, yeah, we're pretty confident Paul wrote it. And in fact, that's how I'm going to assume that Paul wrote it as well. However, it's grouped as if Paul didn't write it because that was not understood at the time. So we have Hebrews and then James, 1st and 2nd epistles from Peter, and then we have the 3 epistles from John, and we end with the epistle from Jude. Okay, so that's how they're organized. When we look at the epistles that Paul himself wrote, so those 14 epistles, there are pretty much 4 different times that it seems like Paul wrote his epistles. It's like 4 different groupings that we can put them all into. The first grouping happened around the year 50. Okay, so this is still in the book of Acts. This is when Paul likely wrote 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. So the 1st and 2nd letters to the Thessalonians. And then a few years later, we have the second grouping, which was probably the years 55 to 57. We get 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, and Romans. So we'll talk about that in a bit. Then the third grouping is the years 60 to 62. So this is towards the end of the book of Acts that we just read. This is when he probably wrote Philippians, Colossians, Ephesians, Philemon, and Hebrews. And then the last grouping is 64 and 65. So this is after the book of Acts ended, but before Paul is martyred just a few years later. That's when he probably wrote Titus and 1st and 2nd Timothy. Okay? Just in case you're curious about how this is all organized. I find this stuff fascinating and I love kind of getting an overview of how the epistles all work and how they're all organized. So with that in mind, let's talk about Romans. Romans is the longest epistle that Paul wrote to a church, right? I know that based off of the order. We're going to spend the next 2 weeks, this week and next week, studying this epistle. Remember, the chapters have nothing to do with anything. The chapters are all man-made things that were put on, that were just made for easy divisions so that we could all reference the same scriptures. But this is all one giant epistle from the beginning of Romans to the end of Romans. Now, why was Paul writing to the Romans? This one's an interesting one because this is actually the only epistle that Paul writes to a group of people he has never met. He had never met the Romans. He had never been to Rome. At this point in time, it was the year, it was in the middle of where we're at in Acts 20, which is his 3rd missionary trip. He had stopped in Corinth for about 3 months. And so while he's here, he keeps thinking about those saints in Rome. And he really wants to go to Rome and he wants to preach the gospel to them, the restored gospel, and help them see that the Messiah had come. And he wanted to write this epistle. So he wrote this epistle to the saints in Rome without ever having gone there. Now, fast forward to where we just ended up in the book of Acts. Did Paul make it to Rome? Yes, he did, after he was imprisoned and shipwrecked and this whole tragic journey, right? But Paul did eventually make it to Rome. He was able to talk to those saints. But this is the only epistle, as I mentioned, that Paul writes to someone he has never met before. That he has, he's not like, how are you doing? He's greeting them for the first time through this letter. So I'm sure it was probably a cool experience for him to then, a few years later, meet them under interesting circumstances and maybe they talked about the letter. I don't know. We have so little record of what was actually happening at the time, so it's cool to kind of think about all these connections that were happening. Okay, so what did Paul write in his letter to the Romans? What did he think these Romans needed to know based off of what he knew about them, right? These devout Jews living in Rome, what did he think they needed to learn? I think you're going to find this interesting. Let's talk about the specific chapters. So chapter 1, he starts by greeting the believers. You'll see that's a very common opening to a lot of the epistles. You've got to have your greeting first, right? He's praising them for their faith. He's sharing his own testimony. He's talking about he is not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. Love that. He talks about importance of gratitude, faith, and then he's listing a bunch of sins that God will judge. So it's like he's given them kind of a warning. And then in chapter 2, he talks about how we shouldn't judge each other, but God will righteously judge us for the sins. And he's going to judge us according to our actions, the things that we actually do. And we will feel anguish or peace in our hearts because of our actions and not based off of who we are. And by that, I mean, Paul's making the distinction that it doesn't matter if you're a Jew or a Gentile, right? This was a huge thing to them at the time, having this restriction lifted that anyone could hear the gospel, not just the Jews, but Jews and Gentiles. And you didn't have to follow the law of Moses. And what's going on here? So Paul's driving home this point that it doesn't matter who you are. You've just got to be righteous and a good person. That's how God is going to be judging us. And if we keep the commandments, we have to make sure we're doing it with a sincere heart and not just teaching it and then not living the commandment. Love these teachings. Okay, moving on to chapter 3. Paul now dives into this idea that the law of Moses is not what saves you. That's what these saints really needed to hear, right? The law of Moses is not it. It doesn't give the Jews an advantage in the next life. Like, it doesn't matter if your heart is not being changed by the law. Your heart needs to be changed and turned toward Jesus as part of following the law. That's what will help you, is if your heart is actually changing. And then he talks about how we've all sinned. We all need to rely on the grace of Jesus Christ. Beautiful doctrine in this chapter, and that Jesus will help us because of his grace. And it's not just by our actions alone. We need to rely on our grace and our faith as well. Moving on to chapter 4, Paul now talks a little bit about Abraham. Okay, Abraham was very revered by the Jews, but Abraham, everyone can clearly agree that he was saved. He lived a good life, right? But Abraham lived before the law of Moses even existed, because the law of Moses started with Moses. And so he's bringing up this point, like, Abraham didn't live the law of Moses, and yet he was saved by his faith. And just a note, in a lot of these chapters, I've mentioned this before, it's going to talk about circumcision a lot. Remember that circumcision was a part of law of Moses, so it's really just being used as a conversation about the entire law of Moses. Of course, circumcision is included in that as well, but you're going to see that kind of as a representative for the entire law of Moses. Chapter 5, Paul talks about faith, hope, patience. Jesus died for us even though we are sinners. We can be reconciled through God through his grace, through his atoning sacrifice, and through our actions. Adam separated us because of his sin. We have spiritual death, but then Jesus can give us eternal life. And finally, chapter 6, Jesus, through his resurrection, has helped save all of us. Our bodies should be used for righteousness, and there's always going to be wages that we have to pay for sin. Anytime we sin, it's not going to benefit us. There will be some sort of wage that we have to pay, and it's usually spiritual death. Okay, you guys, you are going to love diving into the epistles. I love the Epistle of Romans. Have a great time studying in it this week. I think my personal focus question is going to be in Romans chapter 4, verse 13. It talks about how we need our works and we need our faith and we need the Savior's grace. Like, we need that all together. We can't just rely on our works and thinking our works are going to save us. So this week I want to think about, where am I too focused on just keeping the commandment and I'm not adding my faith or any real meaning to it? And how can I maybe change that? All right, have a great week this week and happy studying.